NSW, morgue workers, pathologists, medical examiners, etc. What is the weirdest cause of death you have been able to diagnose? How did you diagnose it? Worked at a funeral home for a few years. First ever house call I took was to pick up a guy who died at home. Heard from his son that he hadn't been to the doctors in 20 years. We take him to the medical examiner and discover he had a hernia on his scrotum, causing it to be the size of a football. Not sure how he lived with that thing, but he was wearing jeans and a jock strap to keep that thing in. His toenails looked like dragon toenails as he obviously couldn't bend over to clip them. You know it's fricked up when the medical examiner calls another medical examiner on duty to say, "Hey dude, come check this out." The short of it, man died from endometrial cancer. Man had a transplant prior. Woman who gave transplant had metastatic cancer that had spread to said organ unknowingly. Man survived transplant but cancer cells from the transplanted organ populated and he ending up dying from her cancer. That is incredibly crappy luck. My dad told us that they once had a guy bleeding out on the table from a stab wound. They stopped the bleeding but his vitals were still taking a dive. Someone points out there's too much blood. They turned him. It's coming out of his butt. Someone had stuck a light bulb up this guy's butt, broken it, and stabbed him when he tried to escape, and he still escaped. They stabilized him but he died of septic shock. This was told to us over dinner, mind you. I'm an apprentice funeral director, but we had an autopsy tech come into my school once to do an autopsy demonstration. He was asked this very question and this was his answer. Male, mid-50s, presented with jaundice and other signs of alcoholism but supposedly no history of drinking. During preliminary observation, techs noted a red liquid coming from the anal area. Assuming blood, it was tested. Came back as red wine and blood. Turns out the deceased was a closet alcoholic who would give himself enemas with whatever alcohol he had. In this case red wine. The doctors concluded he pierced part of his colon rectum with whatever he enamored himself with and led to a bleed. Assuming blood, it was tested. Came back as red wine and blood. Yes, an oaky start, with hints of plum and lower intestine. Complex hemoglobin finish that lingers on the palate. Edit. Thank you for the gold. I will spend it on fava beans. Working the ambulance for a barricaded male. After an hour of standby, trying not to fall asleep, a cop bangs on our window frantically to call us into the house. Guy put a shotgun in his mouth but must have flinched last minute and blew his face off. He was left with just a scream hole that was fluttering flaps of torn flesh, not unlike a predator mouth for a face. Only time I ever saw a nurse shriek at the sight of it. Well, scream hole is the most terrifying phrase I've read all month. I'm a nurse and this 80-year-old man had anal fissures and was admitted to the ICU because he shoved an entire frozen D-cell sized mag light up his butt and perforated his bowel. He went to surgery to have it removed and later died from septic shock. The mag light however survived. Those mag lights are awesome. Edit. Not for anal usage, mind you, but their durability. Did an internship at the office of the chief medical examiner. Guy committed suicide in a river by wearing a backpack of rocks. Was found soon and didn't have much bloating etc due to the submersion. Upon examination, he had a lung infection where his right lung had disintegrated into green liquid. We removed 1.5 liters of green fluid from his chest cavity. His left lung was fine. It was determined after looking at his medical records that he had been to the doctor's office 5 times before he committed suicide and that this infection had been going on for almost a year until it got this bad. Numerous doctors had overlooked it. Accounts from those who knew him suspected that he killed himself to stop the pain. I'm a nurse and I spent the first portion of my career working in an inpatient psychiatric facility. One of my first patients was a woman diagnosed with pica and who also engaged in auto-cannibalism to an extreme that none of the professionals at the facility had ever seen before. When I met her, she had already eaten 4 of her fingers off and 3 toes. She had also bitten off and eaten most of her tongue and the outer part of her lips. She needed to be almost constantly restrained due to having such a high risk of self-harm. Anyway, one day a family member came and said they wanted to take her home after visiting while she was out of restraints. yet being highly monitored. Against all medical advice, the patient was taken out of the facility and home with her family. She died due to blood loss a few weeks later after spending her weeks out of the facility picking a massive hole in her leg. Another is a story a colleague told me. A man came into the OR with a huge eggplant inserted and stuck in his rectum. Funny part was that he said his friend surprised him and shoved it in there as a prank. He ended up needing major surgery and received a colostomy. Died of infection a few weeks later. Quite a few awful stories relating to things being shoved up where they shouldn't. Actually, don't stick huge things up your butt, people. There is no way an eggplant up the butt feels better than eggplant palm tastes. Seriously man, just make eggplant palm then have some sex later. Best of both worlds with no awkward trip to the ear. Worked in the county coroner's office for a while. We got a call and I got to tag along. The call was for a body in a barn, face down in a 55-gallon drum. When we got to the scene, we pulled him out and he was bloated and covered in crap and smelled worse than any other corpse the veteran coroner had ever smelled. This was the middle of August, so decomp had moved along pretty quickly. The cops had found a camcorder on a tripod nearby and thought this may be some kind of gang killing. We watched the tape and it turns out the victim had a scat fetish and had been crapping and pee in the drum for quite some time. He would open the lid, lean over the edge and jack off. Cause of death was heart attack drowning. Was jerking it, went into cardiac arrest, fell into the drum and drowned in a vat of liquid shit. Former biological anthropologist. As an undergrad I worked for a forensic anthropologist. This is the weirdest case she had that I got to see for myself. It was from the 1920s. My boss had inherited a coroner's collection of odd interesting bones he collected during his tenure in a major city. Back then, coroners could just take whatever they wanted from bodies without telling the families. If the individual was poor, indigent, an immigrant, a minority, they really helped themselves, sometimes taking the whole body. This coroner took a lot of stuff, even re-articulating some of the pieces, reconstructing how they looked when they were attached to the rest of the person. So anyway, she has this collection she inherited, and several of the pieces are designated what she calls death by testosterone poisoning. They did not literally die of testosterone poisoning, but they all died because of risky, stupid, ridiculous actions. Think Jackass, only with no monetary payout. The weirdest one was from early last century. A white man in his 40s who died from sepsis from multiple arm fractures that he got in an arm wrestling contest. Why multiple fractures? Because even after cracking his humerus, upper arm bone, a bit, he couldn't bear losing, so he just wrapped it up with some kind of splint, had some guy hold the fracture, just a crack at that point, and went for best 2 out of 3, whereupon he snapped the humerus all the way through, and broke his radius and ulna when he slammed his arm down on the edge of the table in anger. The preserved bones came with the whole story recounted in the coroner's notes. One of the lower arm bones, radius or ulna, I can't remember which, protruded through the skin, and being too cheap, too stupid to see a doctor, the wound became gangrenous, and the infection entered his bloodstream. He died of septicemia a few weeks later. Looking at the bone, I could see all of the fractures, as well as where the infection had attacked the periosteum and the bone itself, with no sign of healing. TLDR. Stupid, pointless arm wrestling contest result in multiple arm fractures, gangrene, and death from septicemia. Labeled jokingly as death by testosterone poisoning by the owner of the anatomical collection the bones are a part of. Slightly off topic but related story. Someone I know had their arm broken while arm wrestling. A couple of weeks later, having had it put in a cast, she broke her other arm. ARM wrestling the same guy. She's still alive and amazingly still wants to marry the guy. Man fell into a septic tank and died because of suffocation, rather than drowning. Found after 3 days. That was one autopsy my staff let me skip, as I started to retch the moment I opened the door to the autopsy suite, despite wearing an airtight mask. Septic tanks and ship's holds are incredibly dangerous places. You get a lack of oxygen or a buildup of toxic asphyxiating gases which can render you unconscious in seconds. Then your work buddy who's watching climbs in to help and passes out as well. A ship with a hold full of steel scrap can be lethal because the slowly rusting steel pulls all the oxygen out of the air. Was a police officer and helped with a case where there was a guy in his 50s who died laying on his couch. He had told friends he wasn't feeling well for a couple days and figured it was some cardiac related event. Nope. Ready for an irrational fear? Guy had undiagnosed hemochromatosis, high iron that destroyed his liver, his ongoing cirrhosis, and the liver's inability to process blood as fast as it was being pumped caused varicose veins in the lining of his esophagus. This was a decades-long process. One day one or more of the esophageal varices ruptures and the guy slowly bleeds to death through his digestive system while thinking he had a stomach bug or something, only to die taking a nap. Get regular physicals, folks. I'm a criminal defense attorney. Had a client charged with murder for essentially getting into a shoving match with a guy. No external bruising or scratching. No evidence of trauma anywhere. They opened his head and found a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Turned out he had a ton of booze and blow in the tox report. The coke had constricted the blood vessels and driven the blood pressure up, and the booze had thinned the blood out. When he bumped his head slumping back, that was all it took, and he blew out and was dead in less than a minute. Really sad case. I'm a criminal defense attorney. Username: Public Pretender. Ha. Nice. Well, not a dead body, but I was a security guard at a hospital in Alaska. One of my duties was to bring deceased folk to the morgue, so I had a key to it. Get a radio call that some patient's wife wants her husband's wedding ring back. I assumed it would be on a deceased person. I go to the morgue to look for it. I look all over. No gold ring. I even open the coolers. No bodies. I then look in the fridge. Body parts and a little igloo cooler. I look inside that. It looks like very old banana peels. I glove up and pull some out. Turns out this guy had gotten his hand shredded in machinery. I had to get the mangled ring off his mangled hand and clean it off and go give it to him. That's above and beyond the call of duty as a security guard. My dad used to be a cop and had a few horror stories from weird deaths he had to attend. One that I remember clearly was a suicide. The guy had been fighting with his girlfriend and they had broken up. But 3 days later she had calmed down and went to his place to try and work things out. She found him dead in his car in the garage, where he had gassed himself. By this time, he had been in the car for 3 days, in the heat of summer, and the body had bloated to the point that it basically filled the driver's seat of the car. The other side of the car was hard up against the wall, so to get the car out of the garage and give them room to work, one of the other police officers had to force his arm and upper body past the body to release the handbrake. After they rolled the car out, underneath where the car had been was a huge puddle of bodily fluids that had seeped out over the 3 days. Apparently all the officers had to burn those uniforms afterwards. Friend is an autopsy tech. Apparently it's not uncommon for cats or small dogs to eat the hands and face off a dead or incapacitated owner. His worst was an elderly woman who was paralyzed, but not killed, by a stroke, and her little dog ate all her exposed skin before she was found. He did her autopsy after she died several hours after being admitted to the hospital. He did her autopsy after she died. Well, that's good, I guess. Went to a hanging in some woods. Young guy who was having family troubles. He'd jumped from a fairly high tree with a rope around his neck. I'm guessing he did this to try and break his neck to make it quicker. Unfortunately he failed this aspect because as he jumped he scraped down a torn tree branch which had gone up his nostril and had come back out through his left eye socket. Poor guy hung there suffocating with the noose, with the pain of a tree branch penetrating his face and eyeball as he did so. Still makes me cringe. I've seen quite a bit. Working at the OCME has been a summer job that morphed into a side job while I'm in school. The top 3 most unusual calls I've been on. 1. A man went to hang himself, and when he jumped off of his apartment balcony he left so much slack that it took his head off. His head was on one lady's balcony and his body was on the ground. When we were there, we couldn't find the head, so we had to knock on a couple doors where the rope was hanging to in order to find it. 2. A man died of a heart attack while masturbating. The responding officers left the pee playing on the television just to make it awkward when I arrived. It was a cassette. 3. A man was sitting on the railroad tracks at a railroad crossing to commit suicide by train, where is very messy and annoying to have to pick up, mind you. But a drunk driver was trying to catch air over the tracks and killed the guy, but threw his body off of the tracks before the train came a couple of minutes later. Bonus, and my inbox blew up. Man shot himself in the head with a shotgun in his bedroom and left the ceiling fan. You know the saying, crap hit the fan? Imagine his brain matter hitting his fan. He basically repainted his walls with an interesting splatter pattern of brain matter and blood in pieces of his face. I tried to clean up as much as I could for the wife, although I'm not required to do any cleaning of the scene. I'm actually asked not to. Sometimes I just feel bad for people. Anyways, don't shoot yourself in the head until you turn off your fan, please. I'm on mobile, so if there's a spelling mistake, I apologize. I'm a zilch. I'm not either, but I was talking recently with a friend who was an undertaker at a funeral home for about a decade, sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. This was when they were in charge of collecting bodies directly from the scene. Someone driving on a country road in Oklahoma noticed a car out in the field, and a young girl, 16/17, crying and screaming hysterically. Anyways, the car was a T-top Firebird or something similar. There was a headless body in the driver's seat, a head in the back seat, along with another boy who had been split in half at the abdomen. This girl was hysterical, so they couldn't figure out what the heck had taken place here. It turns out the driver had been sticking his head up out the top of the car while driving, and the other boy almost sitting up out of the open T-top. They lost control and went off the road, through a barbed wire fence. One or two of the wires went up over the top of the car and cleanly severed the driver's head and the boy passenger in half. He said it took them the better part of an hour to determine what had happened. Then he collected up the pieces and went on with his day. Geez, I feel sorry for that poor girl. I don't think I would ever get over witnessing something like that. Work in a nursing home rehab. Guy essentially died from pooping. He pushed too hard, blood pressure dropped, and that was it for him. New irrational fare. Back in med school, during internship at the coroner's, I saw a case when a man in his late 50s was found dead at home, although under quite peculiar circumstances. His body was found standing, yes, standing, in the bedroom, with one leg raised and resting on the bed, basically as if he wanted to climb on the bed but suddenly died. Further examination led to a severe heart attack as the most likely cause of death. However, no evidence of someone moving the body post-mortem could be found. The conclusion was that either someone would have to have found him quite early and basically hold the corpse for hours until it became stiff enough to stand on its own, or that his death was so sudden that it happened just in the right moment so that his body would be perfectly balanced and not fall over. My friend is a cop. He was asked to do a wellness check on a middle-aged man. The man was seriously obese and had a history of diabetes. My friend knocks on the front door. Nobody. He enters the home and the dude was on the floor, seemingly dead. Apparently when you lay near dead for 3 days, blood pools in the lower extremities and they turn dark blue. It's even worse than diabetics. He saw the dude's legs because the dude was butt naked, covered in his own crap. There was a trail of crap to the bathroom. My friend said the smell made him almost walk out of the house then. He was on the job for about 2 months at this time and then he realized, oh crap, this is my life now. He called paramedics, but the guy died at the hospital. They determined that the guy had a stroke on the toilet and tried to get to the front door to alert somebody he was in trouble and collapsed on the way there, leaving a trail of crap across the house that sat there for 3 days until he was found. When I was in high school, I worked part-time at a funeral home. The county this was in didn't have a morgue yet, so the funeral home's rotating monthly to handle the deaths that would normally go to a morgue. We called it County Month. The weirdest thing I saw was somebody who had committed suicide by drinking some kind of poison that turned their entire body a bright blue. Looked like the forerunner of the Blue Man Group, albeit less lively. I worked briefly as a morgue assistant a few years back. The job mainly consisted of moving corpses and holding organs while the pathologist did his thing. By far the most WTF worthy death I saw was a guy who had been working in a factory, getting himself off by rubbing his dong on the underside of the high-speed conveyor belt he was meant to be operating. He got caught and it tore off most of his crotch. Ruled as death by misadventure. He had bled out, torn femoral artery, before the paramedics even made it to the scene. Death by misadventure makes him sound like a pirate or something. A welder dropped dead working on a ship. It was determined that, working down in the pee-filled bilge, the metal he was welding onto the ship made molten droplets that fell into the liquid around his feet, caused a high enough ammonia concentration to kill him. This was determined by a lab partner of mine who collected her urine for samples several days running and dropped an inch of red hot Bunsen burner heated rebar into those urine samples in Erlenmeer flasks, measuring NH3 via pH meter in the atmosphere above the P. The welder died from urine. When they work in places like that, they are supposed to wear respirators. My mom was a ME for years and she has a handful of interesting stories. As a kid, I grew up on pictures of dead people and she sometimes would ask me to go over her reports to verify that her point was getting across, because if a 14-year-old can understand it, so can a 40-year-old, right? Anyway, I remember 2 specific instances that brought horror to my young brain and sheer joy to hers. A dude committed suicide via suffocating choking himself on his wife's panties. A motorcyclist accidentally rammed himself into some woods. His head was twisted around all demon-like. What my mom was so excited to show me was his legs because it was a 1 in a million case. The dude had gone spread eagle and perfectly struck 2 trees on each side of him, basically snapping off his legs. My mom was so excited. "Isn't that cool?" she exclaimed. I remember vividly. "I want to date your mother. Her interests align with mine." I'm not a medical professional or a mortician, but I think this story is relevant to the question, so I'll share it anyway. A few weeks ago I was driving a guy to a hospital 3 hours away. He was a truly amazing man and regaled me with a myriad of fascinating tales of his youth and previous jobs. He got onto explaining his family and how he had 2 nephews but now only had 1. I asked him what happened. Apparently his eldest nephew, around 28, was riding his motorbike on a weekend out in the countryside here in the UK. They found him later that day, dead, on the side of the road, on a corner, motorbike next to him, with no obvious signs of impact or anything that could possibly have led to his death. It took a long time for them to work out what had happened. Eventually they found a small bruise about half an inch in width on his temple. After some investigation they discovered that the corner of road had just been resurfaced and had some loose stones on top. They concluded that as he rounded the corner about 30 miles per hour, the bike had slid from underneath him. As he rolled to the side of the road, the footrest of the bike had entered the corner of the helmet through the hole where the visor was open and hit him in the temple, killing him instantly. Nothing reckless. No one else involved. Just bad luck. Sometimes that's all you need. And this is one of the reasons why surface dressing is a terrible method of resurfacing roads. A cheap fix that will need to be resurfaced again the following spring when it is full of holes again. The technician here. Where I worked we got a lot of bad cases because we worked with the sheriffs and counties, so we got all hoarders, neglect, etc. We had a chicken with maggots crawling all over its back and literally it was just constant movement, to be euthanized, while someone was holding her on the treatment table waiting for a doctor to become available for euthanasia. Her entire back end exploded, clear fluid and maggots about 8 feet sprayed out. Her bladder and a giant cyst sac fell out of her and she passed. I never thought I would see the day where I was able to say I had a chicken explode on me today at work. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.